Well, tonight, U.S. President Donald Trump is in Italy, where he starts the European leg of his first foreign trip. Earlier today, before wrapping up his Middle East visits, he met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Mr. Trump says that he is convinced Israelis and Palestinians are ready for peace. How they will get there, well, those ideas the U.S. president left for another time.
The City of Peace welcomes the Man of Peace. Early praise for Donald Trump in the West Bank as he sets out to do what's eluded so many before him. Meeting Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, the US president repeated his commitment to peace between Israelis and Palestinians. But that push is light on detail. Trump's avoiding most of the thorny issues that have stymied efforts for decades and isn't talking specifics.
I am committed to trying to achieve a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and I intend to do everything I can to help them achieve that goal. President Abbas assures me he is ready to work toward that goal in good faith, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has promised the same.
A short distance away, protests in support of hundreds of hunger-striking Palestinians imprisoned in Israeli jails. And that's just one of the hurdles to be negotiated in a peace deal, on top of others like Israeli settlement building, the status of Jerusalem, and sovereign territory for Palestinians under a two-state solution. Later, back in Jerusalem, Trump seemed to acknowledge the challenges that lie ahead.
Making peace, however, will not be easy. We all know that. Both sides will face tough decisions. But with determination, compromise, and the belief that peace is possible, Israelis and Palestinians can make a deal.
And with those ambitious words, Trump's Middle East visit is now over. His next stops are in Europe, where the US president will meet Pope Francis and come face-to-face with his NATO and G7 counterparts.
Well, the scandal surrounding U.S. President Trump and possible connections between his campaign team and the Russians is not letting up in Washington, even with Mr. Trump being away. Today, former CIA Director John Brennan testified before a congressional committee and gave the most complete account yet of Russian efforts to impact the outcome of last year's presidential election. Mr. Brennan also confirmed that U.S. intelligence knew last summer of Russian efforts to contact members of the Trump team.
Did evidence exist of collusion, coordination, conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russian state actors at the time you learned of 2016 efforts?
I encountered and am aware of information and intelligence that revealed contacts and interactions between Russian officials and U.S. persons involved in the Trump campaign. I don't know whether or not such collusion, that's your term, such collusion existed. I don't know. But I know that there was a sufficient basis of information and intelligence that required further investigation by the Bureau to determine whether or not U.S. persons were actively conspiring, colluding with Russian officials.
That was John Brennan there testifying earlier in Congress. As the investigations in Washington move forward, more and more people are seeing parallels between the Trump-Russia scandal and the Watergate scandal of the 1970s. Is Trump on the road to becoming another Nixon? Well, who better to ask than a man who had a front row seat at the Watergate hearings? Tonight, I'm joined by Richard Ben-Veniste. He was a Watergate prosecutor, and he was also a member of the 9/11 Commission that was formed in the U.S. after the 9/11 terror attacks. Mr. Ben-Veniste, welcome. It's good to have you on the day. Let me start with what the former CIA boss, John Brennan, told that congressional committee today. He said that he saw evidence of contact between Russian officials and members of the Trump campaign. It's the fullest account we've heard so far connected to this scandal. Does it move President Trump, in your opinion, closer to impeachment proceedings?
Well, first, good evening, and thank you for inviting me. I believe that the evidence is still being collected. We're learning more and more on a daily basis about the nature of the Russian intrusion into our electoral process. And we're learning more about whether U.S. persons, wittingly or unwittingly, were involved in connection with the Russian efforts.
There is a special counsel now investigating lots of the accusations, but many members of Congress, they've signed a petition calling for an independent commission like the 9/11 Commission that you were a member of. In your opinion, does this case warrant an independent commission?
Right now, there's been a very, very significant development with the naming of Robert Mueller, the former FBI director, as special counsel. He now stands in the shoes of the Attorney General of the United States. He has all the powers of the Attorney General to investigate not only whether and how the Russians intruded into our electoral process by hacking the Democratic National Committee, but he also has the power to investigate aspects of Mr. Trump and other members of his campaign and their financial dealings as it relates to the Russia investigation. So that is very significant. The creation of a commission like the 9/11 Commission would take a considerable amount of time, not only to get it started, but also to get it staffed and up and running. And so it might be something that is created for the purpose of looking again at what has been discovered and making recommendations, as we did after 9/11, to ensure that we are hardened in our defenses against further repetitions.
Yeah, the 9/11 Commission, as you well know, had some claims of partisanship, but you were quoted this month as saying this situation with Trump is even more fraught with political partisanship than the 9/11 Commission. I mean, is an independent investigation by a special counsel even possible in this political environment that we have in the United States?
Yes, in a word. We have now, in the remarkable turn of events after the firing of the FBI director, James Comey, by Mr. Trump, an individual in the person of Robert Mueller, who has an exceptional reputation for integrity, for fairness, for nonpartisanship, and for competence, who is leading that investigation now. So I think there's been a sea change in connection with the optimism that we will, at the end of the day, get a report that is credible. Now, Mr. Mueller does not have authority to hold hearings or to make comments about the grand jury investigation or other aspects of his investigation. So it is up to Congress to continue their responsibility to shed sunlight on what is otherwise a dark and mysterious episode.
So what about all of these comparisons then to Richard Nixon and to Watergate? Do you think these comparisons that we're hearing more and more, are they justified?
Well, there are certainly dark echoes of Watergate in what we are seeing. We are dealing with espionage by a foreign power against the United States through the use of cyber intrusion. Watergate was espionage by one political party against the other. Here we have the assertion that U.S. persons associated with the Trump campaign aided and abetted the Russians? We don't know because that evidence has not yet been disclosed. There are many other parallels, particularly in the firing now of FBI Director Comey and the firing of my old boss, Archibald Cox, who was the first Watergate special prosecutor. In both cases, the shock of these firings has really galvanized the attention of the public to look further at what caused a president of the United States to take such drastic steps.
And Mr. Ben-Veniste, speaking of all these parallels between Watergate and the Trump-Russia investigation, I want you to take a look at what former U.S. President Richard Nixon said to a reporter at a press conference back in the early 70s.
Don't get the impression that you aroused my anger. You see,
I have that impression.
You see, one can only be angry with those he respects.
Ouch. I mean, that was a first-class verbal slap in the face for that reporter. I mean, it shows the contempt Nixon had for the media. Do you see the same in Donald Trump?
Well, Nixon was a very strange psychological study. And here we have heard the President of the United States utter the words that the media is the enemy. Nothing could be further from the truth in terms of the way our government is set up to work. We have a First Amendment to our Constitution that guarantees freedom of the press, and so the press is essential to the protection of our freedoms.
All right. Mr. Richard Ben-Veniste, former prosecutor of the Watergate Commission and a member of the 9/11 Commission in the United States. Mr. Ben-Veniste, we certainly appreciate you taking the time to be on The Day tonight and sharing your insights. Come back. We'd like that.